I recently read a report that was saying around 211 significant cyber attacks are going to happen this year. That almost doubles since 4 years ago.
There's no longer this network perimeter. Everything is available wherever, which is great for your average user, more challenging from a cybersecurity perspective.
So what are some of those new threats that you've been dealing with?
Something I've seen recently, actually, malware builders. It would have taken them months to write this code. They did it in a few days with ChatGPT. Big time on phishing. Something like 85% of breaches started as phishing attacks. They're evolving, they're getting more advanced. It's terrifying.
We're still falling victim today. Why do you think that is?
I don't think we're ever going to stop falling for social engineering. By nature, we're very trusting. User training is so important.
How can public sector organisations make sure that they're protecting themselves the best they can from those type of attacks?
I think
Hello and welcome to the Cantium Podcast in partnership with Public Sector Focus. My name's Darren, the marketing manager at Cantium, and with me today is Victor DeVito, the senior cybersecurity engineer at Cantium. Today we're going to be discussing the current threat landscape in cybersecurity, some best practices for public sector organisations to be following, and kind of how AI has been affecting that and how it's going to in the future. Thank you for being here with me today, Victor.
no problem.
So I recently read a report from an insurance company that was saying around 211 significant cyber attacks are going to happen this year. That almost doubles since 4 years ago. So what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, for a start, it's saddening to hear, of course, but I'm not particularly surprised by it. Obviously, 2020 was a big year for everyone. A lot of things changed. Suddenly, everyone was working from home, working remotely unexpectedly. And that was a big increase in cyber attacks to begin with, because obviously there's a large attack vector. All of a sudden, everyone's from home. There's a large attack vector there to focus on. With that still increasing now, I think as there's more introductions to additional, softwares that are coming out, we're becoming more technologically advanced. There's going to be larger focuses and more attack vectors that we'll be able to utilize and exploit from a negative perspective.
Yeah. So how do you kind of personally define what cybersecurity is and what its role plays for organizations?
Absolutely. So for me, cybersecurity is the protection of digital assets. So digital assets, a lot of people just think, that's going to be photos and stuff like that. But anything that is digital is, even your identity, which is digital, is a digital asset in itself. So it's just about protecting that. I like to reference the CIA triad, CIA not being the American one, funny enough. CIA is standing for the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability of your digital assets. So data in particular in this instance, confidentiality is really important to protect and only have that data or digital assets available to who it's meant to be available to. The integrity, you want to make sure that data or digital asset is not compromised, manipulated in any way, and the availability, just to have it available whenever it is required for the necessary persons.
So you say they're on them CIA kind of principles, I'm going to end up calling them. That really rings similar to me about something I've heard around zero trust architecture. Would you say that zero trust forms part of that, or?
I would say they definitely align with one another. Yeah. So zero trust architecture really falls into, it's a very modern term, especially in recent years. We've really been falling into zero trust, where previously we had, one central office location, and that was the perimeter. That was your network. That was everything was in there. You couldn't take anything home with you, etc. These days, a lot of things have changed. We're evolving. And because it's a lot more at home, bring your own device, all of this sort of stuff, there's no longer this network perimeter that was there before. Everything is available wherever, which is great for your average user, more challenging from a cybersecurity perspective. So this idea of zero trust is, instead of focusing on one central location, it's focusing on the user instead and their device, and having more of a user-centric focus.
So for me, there's a big question around how I know that Cantium, for example, splits out cybersecurity and vulnerability management. So vulnerability management, in my eyes, is the kind of proactively looking at threats that we know already exists. I think thanks to our vulnerability manager, Grant, I very much use his analogy around locking the doors and locking the windows, making sure that you're secure from the threats are outside. So for you, where does that line sit between what's vulnerability management and where does proactive cybersecurity begin?
Absolutely. So I think vulnerability management is encompassed within cybersecurity. I think it's great that we've, separated it and sort of divided it, have a lot of focus around that. So from our perspective, where cybersecurity then comes in, obviously we work very closely with the vulnerability management team. And we also have a look out for something called IOCs, which are indicators of compromise. So whenever new vulnerabilities come out and things like that, especially if they're publicly exploitable, the cyber industry will start having a look out who is targeting this brand new vulnerability, which IPs are using this, and those then become your indicators of compromise, those sort of ones that are really targeting you. So we'll go away and sort of have a look out for those, see if we're being targeted by any of that. Obviously, we're then the protection side, defense in depth, making sure you've got multiple layers to protect from these new vulnerabilities that are coming out and really mitigate those threats.
So what are some of those new threats that you've been dealing with perhaps recently? I mean, particularly around public sector, does that tend to differ from enterprise, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. So the threat side of things, you've got to keep in mind that threats and vulnerabilities are slightly different. Your vulnerabilities are your exploits at the end, or can be exploited at the end of the day. Prime example of those from the other year, Log4j was a massive one in 2020 that was used all across the globe. A very common sort of library framework that was used, which ended up having a massive vulnerability in it, which was very heavily publicly exploited and still is to this day. So that's an example of a vulnerability in itself. From the threat side, you've got some of those other attacks that are coming in, like phishing attacks, malware, viruses, etc. Now, a threat could well exploit a vulnerability to get in, but that's sort of your separation between the two. So with regards to the threats that we're seeing, big time on phishing. Phishing is always going to be a massive threat that we will always see. I read a recent report, I think it was the 2024 statistics from the UK government around breaches that had happened over the past year. Something like 85% of breaches started as phishing attacks. It's terrifying, but it's a very common attack vector because it's social engineering at its finest. If you can manage to get an email to the right person and get it through those defensive systems, those email protection systems, etc., they are very easy to sort of target a certain particular user or target a load of users just to Hail Mary, spray and see who it hits, really.
So if that's one of the biggest things you're kind of seeing at the moment, and looks like the industry as a whole is, what are your advice to, like, particularly public sector organizations, because they generally have many more users,
yes,
and not everybody's as technologically savvy as perhaps we would be as yourself or myself working for an IT company, right?
Yeah.
So what advice do you have for those people in particular and how they can help protect their organizations from phishing attacks?
Yeah, so I think user training is really important for a start. I mean, a lot of these phishing emails that we're seeing, they are much more intelligent in the way that they're using grammar, and spelling is accurate, which we weren't seeing previously, of course. So that's definitely something to look out for. Obviously, having a strong email protection system is really important. You can't just rely on your bog standard free mail sort of protections. It's not quite sufficient. So definitely with a proper organization, you want some real decent email protection in there. Something to focus on impersonation protection as well. That's a big one that we're seeing. So to touch upon that in a little more detail, some of these phishing attacks, or majority that come in, they will change display names or have intentionally very similar names to high importance staff members, VIPs, things like that, in an attempt to make a user panic and think, oh my God, the CEO is contacting me directly. I must get this done straight away. And, it's always that sense of urgency in the phishing emails that's to make you think and react straight away without sort of, putting more thought into it.
I'm sure I can remember you doing that same thing to us before. So
yes, you're welcome. But it does raise awareness, of course. So it is really important to flag that. I think from a public sector perspective as well, don't be afraid to outsource your SOC. If you don't have it in-house and you don't have those resources, those skills, it can feel very scary just to sort of, hand your keys to someone else and let them run away with it. But obviously, that SOC is going to be involved with you. They're going to, hold your hand through a lot of it if you need that sort of, direct you on what's happening, etc. So I think that's really important.
You say there about them running away with the keys, though. It's better than somebody else breaking in, taking the keys and stealing them instead, right? Because you don't have the expertise.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I agree. There's another thing I want to touch on that you mentioned there around old attack vectors that have been around for 4+ years.
Yeah.
That we're still falling victim to today. Why do you think that is?
I don't think we're ever going to stop falling for social engineering, unfortunately. I think that's the root of it. Humans by nature, we're very trusting, and, we see something come through, especially with how much that we have on our plates these days. We don't take as much time to sort of read through things and, check and be vigilant. So, if we do have that urgent email come through and we've got 20 other things we're working on, it's really easy just to respond to that instantly, send them the document they wanted. And suddenly that's a data breach in itself, because you've just sent this internal document external, and it's just so easy to fall victim to something like that just through the amount that we have on these days.
So the thing we've seen around public sector with, cloud first, for example, and a lot more things being moved up to the cloud, what kind of trends and things are you seeing there that we're perhaps not thinking about that we did when the server was in the room with us?
Yeah. Firstly, I think cloud-centric is really important. On-prem is legacy these days. Ultimately, it's at risk of, business continuity plans can't really flow if you have, a major disaster or something like that, office fire, etc. Having that availability in the cloud, again, it touches back to the CIA triad, which we spoke about before. If you only have your data available on-prem and something happens, or there's a network outage, something as light as that, when you move that into the cloud, there are those intentional sort of business continuity plans set up to make sure that your data is more easily available and you're less likely to be impacted by, disasters, etc. So I think it's really important to have stuff in the cloud for those reasons for a start. Some of the security perspectives that we need to focus on, I mean, again, talking back to 2020, when there's suddenly this major lift and shift and everyone's working from home, there was a big push on getting stuff into the cloud immediately because it's widely available. You can access that from wherever. I think because there was such a rush at that time, there needs to be considerations into, misconfigurations that could be there. The number of storage account, Amazon buckets, as they're referred to, various things like that, hold data, and people don't realize they've left that wide open to the entire internet, which is quite terrifying. And, there are actively malicious bots that will go and seek that stuff out, try and see what they can find. So I think that's definitely something to consider, is that misconfiguration. On another side, we've got, it's the same as on-prem with your Active Directory accounts, just in the cloud instead. The overprivilege of accounts. It is so easy just to say, oh, I'll give someone global administrator because that'll give them everything under the sun. We need to be a bit more sensible than that these days. Principle of least privilege is really important. That ties back into zero trust architecture with, user-centric behavior and keeping things as little as they need to be, really. We don't need to be granting global admin to everyone. It's a dangerous game to play, especially if that account is compromised. I think that ties me nicely into the last point around, it's great that everything is widely available now, but that does bring risks as well, because those accounts are accessible from anywhere instead of just over a VPN as it used to be. You're going to be getting attacks from all across the globe, and it's really important to not only have a strong password, but multi-factor authentication is so essential. And I don't know if you've noticed in recent years the change from saying two-factor authentication to multi-factor authentication. My opinion is 3 or 4. I mean, the more you have, the better. There's that balance between inconvenience for the user and security. But, some of your crown jewels accounts, like bank accounts, etc., you need multi-factor authentication on those, SMS as well as authenticator apps as well. Those will typically use biometrics like fingerprint ID or face ID, all of those. So it's so important to have that multi-factor authentication with the risk of accounts being compromised, because it then ties back to that defense in depth.
Yeah, you also touched on a point there around kind of, we can now receive attacks from across the globe. I think we can also now receive attacks from across the internet now that AI is involved and machine learning, right?
Absolutely.
So what positives and negatives are you seeing in the cybersecurity field around that?
So touching upon the negatives first, obviously with anything new that comes out, you're always going to get that positive and negative balance. You're going to get the good guys using it for good and the bad guys using it for bad. In terms of some of the negatives that we're seeing, we've had bots for many years, but they've been pretty stupid. You tell them to do something, they'll go away and do it. It's a piece of code that will run and, scour the internet for various things. With AI, that can become a little bit more advanced. You can be a bit more generic with your prompts, ask it generic questions to go a bit wider on what it would normally look for instead of just targeting one particular vulnerability, one particular port. Because you can target this with AI, it can be much wider and it can be more sophisticated. It can search for multiple vulnerabilities. It can then try and exploit them. And once it's in the system, if you've given it an indication of what to do, it could well just go away and carry on with those sort of malicious activities. So it is things that we need to be worried about, a little bit concerned about. But on the flip side to that, with artificial intelligence, we have the positive side of things. So we have, it's been going on for a good few years now. We've got artificial intelligence, machine learning, threat modeling, etc., which uses these positive aspects. Something in particular is with pattern recognition. Artificial intelligence is really good at pattern recognition. Because it's so good at pattern recognition, it can identify anomalous behavior. For example, if I see you logging in every day at 9 to 5, then that's a pattern that I'm going to see regularly, 9 to 5. If all of a sudden you've logged in at 3 o'clock in the morning, that's a little bit unusual for you. And, as much as we can pick that up in our, day-to-day checks as we're going, artificial intelligence will see that a lot quicker. And you can even set it up to have those, automatic responses of, if this is really unusual, suddenly 3 a.m. from halfway across the globe, which we wouldn't expect to see, it can go as much as to lock your account out completely and, just disable your account. And that reduces, the requirement for an on-call engineer. Obviously, it's still important to have that, but that containment in the first instance of as soon as that account's been logged into, identified as malicious and just knocked out is a fantastic response.
Yeah, so that's obviously what's changed for you guys most recently in the past few years.
Yeah.
What do you now see happening in the next few years?
Oh, very good question. Some of these authentication methods that we have, as I've spoken about before, you might know some banks do things like, my voice is my password and things like that, which a few years ago was fantastic. Not that easy to impersonate someone's voice. These days,
Is now.
It's very easy to impersonate someone's voice. So changing your authentication methods just to make sure they're up to date, again, with like SMS messaging. Previous years, that was really secure. But these days, as you know, artificial intelligence can spoof SMS. It's not just artificial intelligence that can do that. Spoofing SMS isn't that difficult. So it's just keeping those sort of methods up to date, I think, is really important.
How do you see the future of cyber threats evolving over the next few years?
I see a similarity to what we're already seeing, obviously, with the use of artificial intelligence is going to be a big one. We've started seeing that over, the last year or so when we've suddenly had this big AI boom. I think something I've seen recently actually was some malware builders, so people who actually write the malware in the first place. It would have taken them weeks or months to write this code. They did it in a few days with ChatGPT, just through asking specific, prompts, etc. If I go to it and I say, write me malware, it's not exactly going to listen to me. But if you understand the crux of how the malware works, for example, ransomware, it's going to encrypt a file. If you say to ChatGPT, I'd like a program in Python or in C# that encrypts files with this encryption method, it won't think you're being malicious at all. It will go, yeah, no problem, and just write that for you. So being able to break down the code in sort of specific ways just to build it up yourself. Artificial intelligence isn't intelligent enough just to run away by itself at this point. It does require that human creativity, those human prompts, but its ability to be efficient with some of the way that it writes codes, etc., just for us then to plug that all together is quite terrifying. So I definitely see an advancement in, AI malware being used in the future, and just the speed that it's going to be able to be produced is going to be quite scary. But again, on the flip side to that, we're going to continue to develop those defense in depth, those faster responses. The way I see it is a bit like Marvel Age of Ultron. If you remember that film where you've got Ultron fighting Jarvis all the time, the good AI versus the bad AI. I really see that being a balance in the future that's going to happen.
Victor, finally, do you have any further advice for public sector organisations that kind of need some help with some cyber resilience?
I think cyber is, it is a big piece in itself. It is scary to look at from an external perspective. So I think, if you do need any of that trusted expertise, etc., ask around, ask people. It's really important to, go to those security experts, get that professional opinion. It's really easy just to run around like a headless chicken and not know what to do. But sort of getting that guidance in the first place is really important to sort of start you on that journey. And as I mentioned previously about outsourcing your SOC, that's not just for those instant reactive responses of there's an incident, we need to resolve it. There's that proactive side as well of we're here to help you strengthen your organization and add that defense and depth.
Victor, I've really enjoyed our conversation today. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Cantium Podcast in partnership with Public Sector Focus, please subscribe wherever you're listening or by visiting www.cantium.solutions.